having the minister and the special envoy of the US to this table here, I would just like my colleague Ruth Isaac to explain for those of you who are attending the session in the Parliament, where and how should we go there. Ruth, please.
Thank you. Those who have accreditation to go to the European Parliament, they can do so themselves, but those that need accreditation, and they are in the list, they need to follow myself or one of my colleagues. We're going to walk to the Parliament because that's the easier thing to do at this stage. We really need to be no later than 1:30 outside. Actually, it's 1:15 or 1:30 is the latest. We have to be outside the Parliament. At the front entrance, a place lacks, and they will escort us to the room itself. But please don't wander off, because otherwise we will not be able to get you on time by 1:15 to 1:30 the latest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And may I welcome Minister of Strategic Affairs of the Government of Israel, Minister His Excellency Gilad Erdan, Mr. Elan Carr, the Special Envoy combating anti-Semitism of the United States Administration, Mr. Tzachi Gavrieli, the Acting General Director of the Strategic Affairs Ministry in Israel, and actually our host, Rabbi Menachem Margolin, who is the chairman of the EJA, the European Jewish Association, that initiate this debate in the European Parliament we are going to tell you about. My name is Tal Rabina. I'm the Director of Strategy of APA, the Europe-Israel Press Association. I'm very glad to see many familiar faces around here, and I welcome you to use our facilities to see Israel, to ask anything you want about Israel, and to join some of our press trip. By the way, right this minute, colleagues of yours are in a press trip, special one in Israel, so we are doing it on an occasional basis, and we will be very glad to see each and every one of you. We're doing press trips about the conflict and, of course, beyond the conflict, so you are mostly welcome. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Rabbi Menachem Margolin, Chairman of the European Jewish Association.
Good morning. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. And a special welcome to Minister Gilad Erdan for making the efforts to be with us today. Dear friends, we need your help. I know that sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand what is there that the Jews want. They are successful, they have a strong country, they are doing well. Is it really their situation is so bad? But at the same time, I am sure you will be all agreeing with me that it shouldn't be a normative and normal that a normative Jew who walk around in the street in Paris, London, and Brussels should be prepared for an attack that might happen to him. And it's not really normal to send children in 2019 to schools that look like a prison. And it's not because of our imagination, but the Jewish people in Europe do face major challenges this time, with thousands of anti-Semitic incitements every year. Actually, instead of seeing the level of anti-Semitism in Europe decreasing every year, we see the level of anti-Semitism in Europe increasing every year, which is not really expected from an issue which have a global consensus. There are different reasons for this subject, but one of the main reasons is because of the movement called BDS. Is a movement that grew here in Europe that are very successful in covering their hatred against Jews by saying that they just have a problem with the policy of the State of Israel. Now, you see, as long as the government in Europe will be committed to fight anti-Semitism, there is no way for anti-Semitism to grow with a clear legislations, with a clear enforcement policy, with zero tolerance and education, and you will not be able to see any anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, despite our repeated warnings, European government does not only allow BDS movement to act in Europe on behalf of the freedom of the freedom of speech, but actually gives support and finance to the BDS movement. Now, let me be very clear to you. BDS movement responsible for the vast majority of physical attacks and social media hatred against Jews in Europe. They incite daily against Jews all over Europe. And they made the life of Jewish people in Europe as almost impossible. BDS perhaps were not very successful in getting Europe to boycott Israel, but they are very successful in making anti-Semitism a legitimate thing. BDS is not a movement that supports Palestinians. On the contrary, the activities of BDS actually harm Palestinians that work at the very same factories that BDS wants to boycott. BDS is a movement that its aim is to bring anti-Semitism to the mainstream, to the academy, to United Circles, and to the media. Minister Erdan will present you today a report that will show you different evidence about the very strong link between BDS and anti-Semitism, which is basically the real anti-Semitism behind the mosque. We need your help, and we do urge you today. The media have huge power. You can bring down companies, you could change policies with your reporting. Please help us to spread the truth and make European government to understand and realize that BDS movement is not a legitimate organization, but this is an organization which is responsible for the vast majority of anti-Semitic attacks in Europe. This step, among other important steps, will make huge difference in the situation of the Jewish people in Europe and will allow the continuation of the Jewish community in Europe and its success. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And before we'll get the floor to Minister Erdan, a short glimpse of the report. Can someone close the light, please? Minister Gilad Erdan, please.
Thank you, Tal. Good morning, everyone. Today, in the European Parliament, I will reveal a new report, an extensive one, about the BDS campaign and its anti-Semitic nature. Today, we will tear off the mask of the campaign to boycott the state of Israel. Exposing and combating BDS is urgent, as we see anti-Semitism rising across Europe. The EU claims to have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, so if that is true, it must have zero tolerance to BDS. In 2018, there were 387 violent anti-Semitic attacks reported against Jews in the West, a 13% rise. This is just the number of attacks that were reported. The real number, dear friends, is much higher. There were 68 violent attacks in the UK, 35 attacks in France, the same number in Germany, and 19 attacks right here in Belgium. Jews were murdered in anti-Semitic attacks, and studies found direct links between campus BDS activity and a hostile environment for Jews on campuses. BDS anti-Semitism must be combated along with anti-Semitism from far right and radical Islamists. BDS anti-Semitism is particularly dangerous because it mainstreams and normalizes anti-Semitism and desensitizes Western audiences to its hate. My goal, since I was appointed as Minister of Strategic Affairs, has been to expose the true nature of BDS. BDS, as you know, tries to mask its true goal of erasing and delegitimizing the very idea of a Jewish state, and tries to hide its links to anti-Semitism and terror. It tries to portray itself as a human rights movement. It is not. Therefore, my first step was to expose the links between BDS and designated terror organizations such as Hamas and the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. And following our exposure of over 100 terror links, BDS financial accounts were closed and leading BDS activists were denied entry or ordered to leave EU countries. Today, we are going to expose the deep anti-Semitism at the heart of the BDS movement. Our report provides over 80 examples of blatant anti-Semitism by key BDS activists and organizations. The same motifs and accusations used by anti-Semites throughout the ages to attack Jews and single them out are now being used to attack the Jewish state and single it out from among the community of nations. Attacking Jews is pure racism, which is not politically correct, as you know. And that is exactly why BDS disguises its anti-Semitism behind a mask of legitimate criticism and progressive language. It twists the language of progressive values, which we all share, of course, in order to promote anti-Jewish racism. The examples in our new report can be divided into three main categories. One, use of anti-Semitic claims and motifs. Israel or Israeli Jews poison water supplies, crucify their victims, steal organs, and control governments and banks. Jews are portrayed by anti-Semitic caricatures, you know, the hooked noses, and as demons or animals. The second category is Holocaust inversion, comparing Israel and Israeli leaders to the Nazis. And the third category is denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination and the legitimacy of the very idea of Jewish state. We use the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism in our report, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And this implementation of the definition proves clearly that due to the common definition, BDS leaders and organizations use anti-Semitic language and images. It also proves that the principles of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. The effect of BDS is, as you know, in Europe, increased anti-Semitism. The delegitimization and demonization spread by BDS stigmatizes Jews everywhere and leads to increased anti-Jewish discrimination. So, what do we expect from the EU and from the European Parliament? We are calling on governments and municipalities to adopt definitions which cover all forms of anti-Semitism including BDS. These definitions should be used for prosecuting hate crimes, protecting Jewish communities and students, and preventing anti-Semitism from creeping into schools, which is unfortunately happening today. European governments must end all funding to BDS organizations. High Representative Mogherini's excuse that the funds are not earmarked directly for BDS activities is absurd. I hope that High Representative Borrell and the new parliament will change this policy. No BDS extremists linked to terror or anti-Semitism should be given a platform in the European Parliament. President Tajani told me a year ago that he had passed a resolution, a unanimous resolution, to prevent members of EU-designated terrorist entities from entering Parliament, the European Parliament. But unfortunately, 2 months ago, 3 well-known BDS activists linked to the PFLP terrorist organization and the Samidun BDS organization spoke right here in Parliament at a BDS event. So again, I call on President Sassoli now to enact measures that ensure that such events are not repeated. BDS should be recognized for what it is: anti-Jewish racism. It should be rejected in the marketplace of ideas, just like classic anti-Semitism and racism are rejected by mainstream society. To conclude, I would like to quote prisoner of Zion and real human rights activist Natan Sharansky, who wrote the following in a foreword to our new report, and I quote: "Just as the anti-Semites of yesteryear sought to prepare the ground for the expulsion and murder of Jews, the leaders of the BDS movement seek to put in place the foundations for a world without Israel. The movement seeks to delegitimize the Jewish state to the point where it is seen by the world as a cancer that should be removed. It is the same approach that created the atmosphere that led to the Holocaust. Never again. Europe must not allow this to happen again." Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. You were referring, obviously, regarding to what happened in Europe, but as we know, we are dealing with a global problem, and we are very, very pleased and honored to have here. This is Elan Carr, the U.S. Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism. Please.
Thank you so much. Minister Erdan, Rabbi Margolin, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is my third trip to Brussels since my appointment as Special Envoy 6 months ago, and it is always a pleasure to be here in the heart of Europe and to participate in the urgent and important topics that the EU confronts on a regular basis. I want to take this moment also to recognize and thank Katharina von Schnurbein, the EU coordinator on anti-Semitism, who is a champion of this cause. I have the great privilege of working with her on a regular basis, and in fact, I just arrived in Brussels last night from Warsaw, where I presented the official United States position on anti-Semitism at the Human Dimension Implementation meetings at the OSCE. And there too, I spoke of Katharina and praised her excellent work. So the EU should be very, very proud to have a clarion voice of morality on this topic. In the last 6 months, we have confronted all forms of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism of the ethnic supremacist far right, the anti-Semitism of militant Islam, and the anti-Semitism of the radical Israel-hating left. This is my charge, and I do that on behalf of the President of the United States and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who are leaders committed in unprecedented fashion to the fight against anti-Semitism throughout the world, to the protection of the Jewish people, and to support of the State of Israel. In his 2019 State of the Union address, President Trump referred to anti-Semitism, as he has many times since, as a vile poison. He always talks about the vile poison of anti-Semitism. And the reason he does is because, as I just said in Warsaw at the OSCE, anti-Semitism isn't only about Jews. And the fight against anti-Semitism isn't only about protecting Jews. Although if it were, that would be reason enough to do it. That would be moral reason enough. But it isn't. The president calls it a vile poison because it is human history's greatest barometer of suffering. Every society that drinks of this poison rots to its core and produces misery at a level that defies description. Certainly that lesson is known all too well here in Europe. And so the fight against anti-Semitism is really the fight for our collective future. What kind of countries, what kind of continents, what kind of world do we want our children and grandchildren to inherit? And to fight against this ancient and relentless human sickness is one of the absolute keys to fulfilling our promise to the next generation deserving of a better world. I do this on behalf of the Secretary of State as well, my boss, who before 18,000 activists at the AIPAC Policy Conference declared, and I quote, "Let me go on the record, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism." That is the policy of the United States. And that's why we are here today. Look, my first trip as special envoy nearly 6 months ago now was to Eastern and Central Europe, where I had candid conversations about the dangers of emerging far-right movements, neo-Nazi movements that express classical and unvarnished anti-Semitism. In a month, I expect to go to the Gulf and have direct conversations with our friends and allies in the Gulf to talk about anti-Semitism in the Arab and in the Muslim world, which, by the way, affects not only the Middle East, but directly affects the European street and the US college campus. But this third form of anti-Semitism, the so-called new anti-Semitism of the far left, is why we are all here today. And it is very, very important that we understand that this form of anti-Semitism is no less dangerous, no less pernicious, no less relentless than classical anti-Semitism. In fact, one of the chief dangers of the so-called new anti-Semitism is its widespread acceptance. And this is why I thank the rabbi for saying we need the help of every influencer to point to what this really is, which is classical, old anti-Semitism simply repackaged and rebranded and cloaked poorly under the fig leaf of anti-Zionism and anti-Israel activity. And so let me go down the list of key features of traditional anti-Semitism and show you how each of those features recurs in precise fashion with the so-called new anti-Semitism, which compels the conclusion that there is nothing new about the so-called new anti-Semitism. Blood libels. Throughout history, classical anti-Semites accused Jews of the most appalling and always fictional things. Baking matzah with the blood of Christian children. You all have heard these canards. Well, blood libels are applied today to the state of Israel. That Israel is a genocidal regime, an apartheid regime. I've seen it said and published that Israel infects children with viruses. Blood libels then, blood libels now. Nothing new. Let's look at rhetoric. A European Jewish leader was recently called a dirty Zionist, as though the substitution of that word might confuse us as to what is really meant. My own grandfather, by the way, in Iraq was arrested on charges of Zionism. He had no connection to the fledgling state of Israel. It was because he was a Jew. So the same rhetoric, just repackaged. Same rhetoric then, same rhetoric now, nothing new. How about isolation and delegitimization, a classic tactic of traditional anti-Semitism, the Jew as illegitimate in the community, not part of the family of our communities, ominous, threatening an outsider. Same thing, we see today with the state of Israel, the Jew among the countries, illegitimate, its existence questioned, its in fact creation undermined, and in fact the basis of its existence, Jewish ethnicity, denied and questioned on a regular basis. Economic boycotts, and it's important to remember, economic boycott is only one aspect of the so-called BDS movement. Economic boycotts then, economic boycotts now. We all have seen the pictures of brown shirts in front of shops, kauft nicht bei Juden. Well, now it's let's boycott the Jew among the countries. Don't buy from the Jew. Economic boycotts then, economic boycotts now. Also, nothing new is the obsessive, compulsive focus on this hatred. We've seen that throughout history with classical anti-Semitism. It's no different with Israel hatred. Let me tell you a story. A student, because students sadly often find themselves, and you mentioned Minister Erdan, the campuses, students find themselves too often on the front lines of this despicable anti-Semitism. A student at a prestigious university gave me an answer sheet to his math class. And it says the derivative of so-and-so is such and such, the integral of such and such is so-and-so. And then it says, another day in the occupied Palestinian territory, Zionist forces murdering children. And then it goes back to math. This kid who gave this to me said with exhaustion in his voice, he said, in math class, I can't even escape this? In math? No, that's right. You can't escape this in math class.